super friends, my name is Annie and welcome back to another episode of Superhero Saturday, where we talk about the arts of superheroes, storytelling, and so much more. Today we are continuing our little mini-series on controversial writing tips, which are some of the tips from my best professional writing advice that some people might think is just straight up blasphemy. Like with most of my advice, this can be applied to pretty much any art form, but it works particularly well with writing, so that's what we're going with today. So this week I would like to encourage you guys to not start writing with chapter 1. What are you talking about? If I don't start with chapter 1, then where am I supposed to start? The middle? That makes no sense at all! That's like eating a banana from the side! See? Yes, I know this piece of advice is a little more weird than controversial, especially without an explanation, so let me give it to you. When I say don't start with chapter 1, it's because I know just how important that first chapter is. We live in the age of Google instant searches, of Amazon 2-day delivery, of TikTok. Now more than ever, a good first impression is everything when it comes to hooking new people into new content. Because our world is so chock full of promotional media, it's only natural that people will develop a very quick sense of being able to determine whether some promotional material is worth investigating or not. Once you get someone to open up your book, it takes only a moment for them to decide if they want to keep reading or not. For most people, this happens within the first 3 pages, but in reality, it happens in the very first paragraph. That's what makes chapter 1 the most important part of your book. People will decide if they want to read my book based on just the first 5 seconds of looking at it? Whatever happened to not judging a book by its cover? Ugh, this is so much pressure! Exactly. As always, if you have some kind of really cool idea at a random moment and inspiration strikes you, I always encourage you to write it down and keep a note of it. But don't think that that is going to be the ultimate final draft and the absolute ultimate perfect version of what your chapter 1 is going to be. That's a tip for another time. What I am saying is that when you first start working on your piece, you need to start with something that isn't something the readers are going to see first. That way you can get a really good feel for your characters, your setting, and your style before you start working out the final details and polishing things up. Then later on, you can go back and figure out what exactly is going to be your perfect first line. Now, if you're not starting out with your first chapter, I have 3 different tips to help you get started, and then later on, after you follow those 3 tips, you can go ahead and start working on that first chapter. The first one is something I call a character test. This is where you take your characters completely out of the context of your story arc and following them along as they do something in a really low-stakes scenario and just kind of seeing how they do what they do. If you're writing a superhero story, then go ahead and give them a really low-profile criminal, not your brilliant and powerful supervillain, and start them off with a chase scene. Or better yet, find your hero doing something so ordinary and boring that it really wouldn't have any place in your book to begin with. What does their day job look like? Where do they go for lunch? When they hang out with their friends, what do they like to do together? Even how they take their coffee. All of this can help you get comfortable with that character and see what they're like. The most important thing about a character test, though, is to learn the character's voice. For example, do they have an inner monologue? Does their writing sound better in first person or should it be in third? Are they funny or do they just think they're funny? How do they interact with the other characters in the story and what are their relationships like? And most importantly, what kind of choices do they make when the fate of the world does not rest on those outcomes? These things have to become the foundation for your story, because you might have the coolest or most novel plot devices the world has ever seen, but if your characters are boring and flat, or you just aren't familiar with them, then people aren't going to connect with it. People invest in people, and if your readers don't know what kind of people your characters are, then it's likely that they're just gonna leave. but I have this idea for a really cool redemption arc that crosses over 5 different books and 3 different planets. How am I supposed to do a character test when the character is so different at any point in the story? It's great that your character develops over time, but you also don't have to do just one character test. Write a few. Write one from early in the story and write one from near the end. Find some downtime in the plot where your character has a little bit of a break and find out what they do during that time. And then mix it up a little bit. If your instinct was to do it in first person, switch it up to third just to have some fun with it. I know it can feel weird taking your characters out of their natural habit, but I promise you, it's a lot easier to mess with and learn your characters and develop their prototypes in something that isn't part of your main story. Not only does the character test relieve that pressure of making something absolutely perfect the first time, but it gives you time to improve on your work. If you thought your love interest was supposed to be a jock and it turns out that they are better cast as a nerd, then change it. If your protagonist's sister was just supposed to be a side character, but you actually really like exploring their relationship through your character test, then add more of it to the story. You don't have to stick with the first thing that comes out of your head. And this is your opportunity to mess with things and tinker around and see what works. Work on it, grow, adapt, and make your art better. And maybe yourself too. The second sub-tip that I have for you in this little advice video is to plot ahead in your story. This is another way to help you avoid writing a bad chapter 1. Mostly the idea is that you should know where you're going before you get there, at least a little bit in advance. This works really differently for a lot of different people. Some people like to just write bullet point notes, other people like to draw diagrams. For me, I like to do this thing where I write down events and happenings on sticky notes and put them on the wall so that they form some kind of timeline. I've done this for about 10 years now and it's a lot of fun, especially when I'm like right in the midst of figuring out what happens with all of the different plot points. Sometimes I even color code the sticky notes for different characters and have 2 different timelines or more going simultaneously so I can see what's going on at any given moment for each of the different players in the story. Plus, I don't even have to know the specifics of what's going on. I just have to write on the sticky note a big fight scene here between the bad guy and the good guy and stick it up on the wall. And because they're sticky notes, if for some reason something doesn't seem to flow right, I can take that sticky note off and rearrange all the tiles, and it's no big deal. Once I have my sticky note timeline all finalized, what I like to do is then transfer it over into a document and write it up in like bullet point form. That gives me a chance to kind of elaborate a little bit on each of the different elements and make notes of different influences and character points and kind of work from there. The cool thing about having it all laid out like this is that your outline then becomes your checklist. So when you sit down to do your writing, you can see everything all laid out and say, okay, today I'm going to write this scene right here. And when you're done, you can check it off your list. And then if you are particularly feeling inspired on a certain scene, you can skip ahead and do that one, and then come back to the rest later. It also helps you keep a perspective on what's going on so that you can add in a little bit of nuance or even some foreshadowing in earlier scenes. For example, if your main character is dating a guy who is part of the local gang that she's fighting against as a caped crusader, that's going to really frame their date scene early on a little bit different than you might expect. That way you can sow the seeds for all of your future plot points. But I don't know where the story is gonna go yet. I want to explore and find out what happens while it comes at me. I do have some ideas, about the middle, and then there's this really cool fight scene, and, eventually the bad guy's gonna go to jail or whatever the heck, but I don't know where I'm going. How am I supposed to plot forward if I don't know what's going on? The answer is, you don't have to know. If you're working on a scene and you're kind of like in the groove and you're writing along, and you're like, oh yeah, this is awesome, this is what I'm going on, and then you get stopped because you can't think of how the hero gets out of this situation, that's okay. What I've found a lot of writers do is they just kind of summarize what has to happen and put it in brackets so that they can go back and find that easily and fix it later on. For example, you could just put bracket Super Annie escapes her captivity and finds the self-destruct button on her way out, and then end bracket it and then move right along. Then you can just come back and figure that out later. Because if you're working and you're in the groove, don't stop for anything, even if you don't know what it is you're stopping for. You have to write the first draft, no matter how bad it is. And you'll come back for revision later. So why not save yourself some time and just move on ahead? Speaking of coming back to things, okay. So I've written some character tests. I've plotted the story out. I've got most of everything figured out, what's gonna happen. I know all of that kind of stuff. Now can I start chapter 1? Yes and no. Okay, now you're just being purposefully problematic. I know it's kind of dumb, but I wouldn't call it controversial writing advice if it was easy and everybody knew how to do it. Yes, you can start writing chapter 1 now, but you have to remember how important it is for your story. That brings us to our final mini sub-tip of this video, which is to write the first chapter last. Even with everything figured out, what I actually recommend is that you start with chapter 2. Pretend that your reader already knows what's going on, so you don't have to worry about characterizing and describing things and telling everyone what's going on. Get right into the meat of the story. Oftentimes, writers get hung up on these descriptive elements, or even start too early in the timeline. By skipping ahead to chapter 2, you can just go ahead and pretend that your reader already knows what's going on. Forget trying to explain yourself and just tell your story. Then keep writing. Write your whole first draft. Make it all the way to the end of your story, where the hero is victorious, the bad guy is brought to justice, and the love interest expresses their hidden feelings for your protagonist. Then go back and write your first chapter again. Now that you can see where you're going, you're comfortable with your characters, and you know how your story feels, you'll have a much easier time introducing your audience to your world. You can then take that extra time to figure out just how to hook people on page 1, because you already know how awesome it is on page 51, and you want to tease them to come with you on this adventure. Again, this advice can be transferred to any art form. Inspiration can strike us anywhere, but following through with the production of a piece requires outlining, drafting, polishing, revising, and all sorts of other things, all before the final presentation is even considered. With all that writing on whether or not the reader decides to binge your book based on that first paragraph, why wouldn't you give yourself the time and consideration to do that first page properly? By skipping chapter 1. Have you tried this on your own artistic endeavors? How do you like to approach a new piece? Do you think this is actually controversial writing advice, or is this just common knowledge? Go ahead and comment down below and join in the conversation. And if you liked this video, go ahead and give us a big thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you would like to see more superheroic content every single Saturday. You can join the team by following us on social media or supporting us over on Patreon. And if you want to see my own advice in action, you can go to our website at www.fearless9.com and check out all of my books there. Thanks again for watching, Super Friends, and we'll see you next week.
Breathe. Wiggle it out. That was not a very good wiggle.
Shark attack. Uh-oh. Now more than ever.
More and ever?
I told you I was having a hard time.
Okay.
Now more than ever, a good. I'm sorry, I'm not used to working with anyone else.
No, you're not.
Did that make sense?
I have no idea what you're saying.
Okay. With all that writing on, I can't understand what words are.
Now you know how I feel.
Oh, I wasn't supposed to say that.
Am I missing words?
Yes. What does their day job look like? I'm sorry, is that funny? Oh, I was gonna get a banana.
Should I go get one?
Maybe.
One banana coming up.
Press the red button.
Were you not recording?